Welcome back. In our last two episodes, we waded through the often brutal realities facing protesters in autocratic regimes, navigating repression, hoping for security force defections, dealing with external meddling and internal splits. Today, we change scenery. What happens when mass demonstrations erupt not against a dictator, but within a system that calls itself democratic? You might assume people power would fare better here. After all, aren't democracies supposed to be responsive? Well, yes and no. While protests are common, sometimes huge, the outcome we're focused on, regime overthrow, is exceptionally rare in established democracies. Why? The reasons are different, often less overtly violent, but arguably just as effective in preserving the system. Today we explore the velvet glove, how democratic structures absorb protest energy through institutions, how cultural norms might play a role, and the phenomenon of protest fatigue. Let's see why democratic resilience often looks less like an iron fist and more like a sponge. The first major difference in a democracy is the sheer number of other things unhappy citizens can theoretically do besides taking to the streets. Autocracies often leave protest as the only outlet. Democracies provide alternatives. This is what David Meyer and Meyer Tarrow called institutional channeling. The idea is simple. Democratic systems have built-in pressure valves. Don't like the government? You can vote them out, maybe. Feel your rights are violated? Sue them if you have the resources. Want a policy changed? Lobby politicians, start a petition, get media attention. These channels, however imperfect, exist. What often happens is that the raw energy of a street movement gets siphoned off into these more respectable, predictable, and ultimately less system-threatening activities. Recent work by Della Porta and Diani has refined this concept by examining what they call institutional permeability, essentially how receptive different democratic institutions are to movement demands. This creates significant variation in outcomes, from superficial co-optation to meaningful reform, but rarely system overthrow. Think about it, movements start demanding radical change, but end up forming NGOs, running candidates, drafting legislation, engaging in endless court battles. Success gets subtly redefined from overthrow the system to win the next election or get this law passed. The U.S. civil rights movement is a powerful example. It used disruptive protest brilliantly, but also engaged heavily in legal challenges, voter registration, and lobbying, ultimately achieving landmark changes within the existing constitutional framework. We see this pattern repeating with recent climate movements. Since 2019, millions have mobilized globally in climate strikes and protests, but the primary outcomes have been policy tweaks, court cases, and electoral shifts, not regime change. The system absorbed the challenge and, in doing so, arguably reinforced its own legitimacy. Beyond formal institutions, there are cultural factors at play. In many established democracies, protest isn't seen as a prelude to revolution. It's just part of the political landscape. It's noisy, it's inconvenient, but it's often normalized, even expected. This connects to ideas about political culture. Even when people are furious about specific policies or politicians, there's often a deeper, underlying belief in the legitimacy of the democratic system itself. The idea of elections, the rule of law, peaceful power transfers. Protests, therefore, are often framed, by participants and observers alike, as attempts to influence decisions within that legitimate system, rather than to tear it down entirely. Media framing plays a crucial role here, as Todd Gitlin's seminal work demonstrated. Mainstream media typically present protests as expressions of particular interest groups operating within the system, not as fundamental challenges to it. This framing subtly reinforces system legitimacy, even while covering dissent. When protest becomes normal politics, it ironically loses some of its revolutionary potential. It's less likely to be perceived by the public, the media, or even the state as an existential threat requiring an existential response. Think about Japan after the intense protest movements of the 1960s. While protests certainly didn't vanish, the large-scale, system-challenging mobilizations became much rarer as the democratic system consolidated and perhaps societal priorities shifted. We've seen this with the women's marches from 2017 to 2023. Despite drawing millions of participants globally, they were predominantly framed as expressions of civic participation rather than systemic challenges. The meaning of protest changed in that context. It became less about overthrow, more about specific grievances within an accepted framework. Not all democracies are equally resilient, of course. Political scientists distinguish between consolidated democracies, those with deep roots, strong institutions, and widespread acceptance, and transitional or unstable ones. In consolidated democracies, the system is simply better equipped to absorb shocks, including mass protests. Governments might resign, policies might change, but the fundamental democratic regime type is rarely questioned. It's worth noting that even in the context of democratic backsliding, a concern in many democracies between 2015 and 2024, protests typically aim to restore perceived democratic norms rather than overthrow the democratic system entirely. The goal becomes defending democracy rather than replacing it. In stable contexts, another phenomenon often kicks in: protest fatigue. The first time 1 million people hit the streets, it's huge news. The 10th time, maybe less so. Media attention wanes. Activists burn out from the immense effort required to mobilize without seeing transformative results. The broader public might become desensitized or even annoyed if protests seem constant but fruitless. Political elites also adapt. Governments learn to weather protests through strategic timing, selective concessions, and narrative control, further reducing protest effectiveness over time. Take France's Yellow Vest movement from 2018 to 2020. Despite unprecedented persistence and occasionally violent confrontations, the outcome was policy adjustments, not regime change. The very stability and predictability of the democratic system can make sustained revolutionary fervor difficult to maintain. Protests signal discontent, but the system signals its endurance. This contrasts with less stable democracies, where protests can sometimes tap into deeper institutional weaknesses and contribute to more significant political crises. Though again, outright regime overthrow driven solely by protest remains the exception, not the rule. So let's wrap up our look at why mass demonstrations also face an uphill battle in democratic contexts. We explored how democratic institutions often act like a sponge, channeling protest energy into less disruptive avenues like voting, lobbying, or legal action. As Meyer and Tarrow described, with varying levels of institutional permeability shaping outcomes, as Della Porta and Diani have recently shown. We discussed how the normalization of protest and the underlying legitimacy of the democratic system itself can blunt the revolutionary edge of mobilization. It becomes part of the process, not a threat to the process. This is reinforced through media framing that presents protests as interest advocacy rather than revolutionary action. Finally, we looked at how democratic consolidation makes systems more resilient, and how repeated large protests can suffer from diminishing returns due to protest fatigue, elite adaptation, and public disengagement. These dynamics were clearly visible in movements like France's Yellow Vests. The key insights? Democracies have their own, often more subtle, ways of managing and neutralizing mass dissent compared to the iron fist of autocracy. Absorption, channeling, and normalization replace overt, widespread repression as the primary tools. Additionally, the multi-institutional nature of democracies means power is distributed across branches of government, bureaucracies, and various levels from local to national, making it harder for protesters to identify and target a single decisive leverage point. Success for movements in democracies is often measured by policy wins or personnel changes within the existing framework, precisely because the framework itself provides these avenues and maintains legitimacy. Overthrowing the whole democratic system via protest is, therefore, exceptionally rare. We've now looked at the distinct challenges in both autocratic and democratic regimes. But there's a powerful force reshaping the landscape for both: technology. How are digital tools changing the game for mobilization, surveillance, and control? That's our focus next time in Episode 5, as we examine the double-edged sword of technology in the age of contention. Until then, this is Kaede, signing off.